In 1947, the United Nations voted on Resolution 181, which addressed the partition of the territory, until then controlled by England, in the region of Palestine. The proposal was to divide the region into a Jewish state and an Arab state, each with its own ethnic and religious characteristics. As soon as this proposal was announced, and with the news that England would soon withdraw its troops from the region, a series of attacks between the two peoples began, starting with an attack by Arabs on a bus carrying Jewish passengers from Netanya to Jerusalem on November 30th. These acts of violence were also carried out by the Jews. In cases of small paramilitary groups that attacked Arab villages to clear access routes between predominantly Jewish settlements. For example, Deir Yassin in April 1948. Contrary to what people think, Jews were not inserted into the area of Palestine at the end of World War II. There had already been practitioners of Judaism in the region for millennia, and many groups gathered in militias to ensure the survival of their members. The Jews who lived in Palestine before independence in 1948 were called Yishuv, and one of the paramilitary groups of the Yishuv was called Haganah. As early as 1945, some Yishuv had already realized the importance of having local production of ammunition and weapons to help with regional defense. In the event that a major conflict broke out and they found themselves isolated. Even so, places like the Ilon Institute were created. The institute was a secret underground facility located beneath a kibbutz. It produced small caliber ammunition, infantry weapons, and mortar shells in quantities sufficient for a small war effort. With the end of the British presence in the region approaching, the Yishuv declared their independence, thus creating the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. The Arab neighbors, upon hearing the news, launched a ground invasion within just a few hours. A force of armies from Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, and Syria attacked Jewish villages in the state, which with only a few hours of existence was already engaged in a large-scale war. The Haganah would soon change its name and organization, moving from its status as a paramilitary group to officially become the Israeli Armed Forces, now called the Israel Defense Forces. But after all, what was the situation of the Israelis in this conflict? The Arab armies had the advantage of initiative. They attacked first, and their goal was to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state in the region. Most of the countries had relatively modern artillery, with few aircraft available, most of them from the World War II period, and with the initial number of invaders being around 13,000, a number that would later reach 60,000 soldiers during the conflict. And this union of Arab countries had something that the Israelis did not have yet: combat armored vehicles. But the leaders of Israel knew very well that to fight steel, you needed more steel. And so begins the story of the intrinsic connection between the Israeli army and its armored vehicles. When the conflict began, Israel had many improvised armored trucks, adapted for the installation of weapons, and with different chassis and sizes. In addition, M13 and M5 half-tracks were also available in large numbers, equipped with machine guns, cannons, and mortars. But these vehicles, although capable of withstanding small arms fire, were no match when facing real armored vehicles. The Arab forces did not exactly possess a super-modern arsenal. The other attacking forces also had armored vehicles from before the war, and some others from the beginning of the conflict. Even though outdated, these vehicles were combat tools that could, against targets without the ability to fight back, cause great damage. So the Israelis began desperately searching for new ways to re-equip their armored forces. And it would be through cunning and adaptability that they would achieve their goals. These are characteristics that are still present in the composition of their army today. The first modern combat vehicle to join the ranks of Israel would be an M4 Sherman, found abandoned in Palestine by the British. Since the efforts to withdraw were immense, the British couldn't take the tank, which had already been abandoned because it needed repairs since 1943. When they left, they made sure to do everything they could to disable the tank so it couldn't be used in future battles, and then they abandoned it. But even after 5 years abandoned, rotting in a warehouse with efforts made to scrap it, Israel put in maximum effort and it worked. After extensive restoration work, the Sherman was armed with a 75mm short cannon, standard for early Shermans, and was given the name Mir. But this wouldn't be the only M4 to take part in the fighting. The others that Israel would use in the conflict would come from Italy, where a group from Israeli intelligence found 32 Shermans armed with the 105mm howitzer, available for sale. The problem was that these vehicles had been demilitarized and the barrels of their cannons had been rendered unusable to prevent firing. The Italian Shermans arrived in Israel in 3 batches, with the last one arriving in January of 1949 in Haifa. Since in most cases the 105mm howitzers could not be restored, Israeli engineers had to look for other alternatives. The first option came with the purchase of 50 Krupp 75mm mobile cannons from Switzerland in September of 1948. But the modifications needed to use these weapons on the Sherman were extensive and took prohibitively long, with only a handful of vehicles with these specifications being ready by the end of the conflict. But Israel had managed to purchase a number of M3 75mm cannons from Italy and soon installed them on some of the other chassis. They managed to deploy approximately 14 Shermans in the 1948 war, with only one being lost in combat, which was nicknamed Tamar by the soldiers. In addition to the M4 Shermans, the Israeli forces were reinforced with at least 2 British Cromwell armored vehicles, after British Jewish soldiers deserted and took the vehicles with them. The Israeli armored battalion was also reinforced by the French, who, along with other weapons, sold a large number of H-39 Hotchkiss armored vehicles to Israel in a friendly relationship with the country that would last for almost 2 decades. And it was by using this diverse force of armored vehicles coming from all over that Israel had to manage against a more numerous enemy, attacking from all directions. What was seen, however, challenged the confidence of the Arab officers for decades. The Israelis slowly began to retake their territory, and by the beginning of 1949, several armistices were negotiated with each of the invading countries separately. With a high number of casualties on both sides, the conflict saw Israel emerge as a stronger country than expected, and from the very beginning, it understood that its existence would depend directly on the firepower it could use against its possible aggressors. Israel would have its peace, but not for long. In 1956, the Suez Crisis occurred. The Egyptian president at the time, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the company that controlled traffic in the Suez Canal, one of the most important trade routes in the world, even to this day. But England and France, countries that owned the company that managed the canal, found such a measure unacceptable, since they would also be seriously hurt financially and strategically in the global context. Since France at that time was a major ally of Israel, and the latter would also be affected by Egyptian control of the canal, it was then decided to take military action against Egypt. Israeli military forces began the invasion of the Gaza Strip and Sinai on October 29, 1956, with paratrooper troops infiltrating strategic locations, supported by and followed by the advance of armored forces through the desert. The Israeli army now had a much larger number of tanks, more modern ones, and with greater influence from French arms imports in recent years. But the Shermans were still very present in the composition of the troops. Israel still operated 300 Sherman units of all chassis variants, but with more powerful armaments than those previously used. Long guns, 76 millimeters, and French FL-11 guns, 75 millimeters, offered greater accuracy, range, and penetration power than the short light guns, 75 millimeters, from the beginning of World War II, which equipped almost all Israeli M4 She. Another prominent combat vehicle in Israel's steel forces in the 1950s was the AMX-13 from France. These light armored vehicles were lighter and used to flank enemies during high mobility combat in the desert, and they featured powerful, fast reloading weaponry. They helped inflict many casualties on the enemies. Defending the Sinai area and the Suez Canal, the Egyptian army employed a range of Soviet-made armored vehicles from the end of World War II. Among the most common were the T-34-85, the Red Army's prominent medium tanks, which were equipped with more advanced cannons than the base versions of the armored vehicle, and the monstrous Iosif Stalin, 3 heavy armored vehicles, which only arrived at the end of World War II, but featured a design unlike anything seen before. During the battles, even though the Israelis had a tactical advantage, the Egyptian armored vehicles proved to be considerable opponents for the Israeli steel. The T-34-85 combined deadly agility and firepower, even a decade after its conception. Meanwhile, the Joseph Stalin III, also relatively outdated, proved resilient against the most advanced French cannons. Its armor, over 150 millimeters thick in some areas, was hard to penetrate, which was quickly noticed by the Israeli crews. But one point in the conflict that cannot be denied was the advantage of air superiority. With the support of jets, also of French origin, such as the Dassault Ouragan, Israel could attack enemy armored columns even before they were engaged by any ground forces. France and England even proposed an armistice between Egypt and Israel, which resulted in nothing. Thus, an airborne attack on strategic points of the Suez Canal was carried out by British and French troops who took control of those locations. Seeing that they were about to lose their positions, Egyptian troops sank a large number of vessels in the canal, making navigation there impossible for almost a year. It is a fact that the actions of the British and the French helped Israel achieve its objective, with many historians stating that there was a collusion between these 3 countries to diminish the power of President Abdel Nasser. The conflict would come to an end after immense diplomatic and economic pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, who handed control of the canal over to Egypt. Israel only withdrew from the Sinai in March 1957, sabotaging Egyptian communication and transportation infrastructure on their way out, managing to identify its strengths and weaknesses at the end of the conflict. The Israelis had managed to organize a large amount of military equipment across a wide region, coordinating the efforts of air, land, and naval forces. But in terms of logistics, they had noticed a low performance, since in general the Israeli supply sector only had to supply the country's own territory, which was a relatively small area. With the advance into Egyptian territory, the supplies had to travel a much longer route than usual, which caused problems in sending ammunition and supplies to the troops at the front in some cases. Even though American economic pressure was the main reason for the ceasefire and the withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt, after the end of the fighting, there was a great rapprochement between the Arab world and the Soviet Union. And this was reflected in the subsequent rearmament of many countries using exported Soviet military equipment, mainly in the form of the fearsome T-54 tanks. The T-54 were medium tanks, known for their reliability, firepower, and armor, in addition to being produced in much greater numbers than their European and American rival tanks. Israel observed this increase in the offensive capability of its neighbors and opponents, and also began to research alternatives for its defense. The alternatives came in two forms: armored and from different places. In the early 1960s, Israel bought 50 Centurion tanks from England, called Shot or Whip in Portuguese, in Israel. This armored vehicle had a special feature, as it was one of the vehicles that introduced the concept of main battle tank or main battle tank. In this concept, instead of a force being made up of vehicles from different classes, it chooses to have a homogeneous lineup of vehicles that can carry out different missions, saving on maintenance and logistics costs and giving greater flexibility to its armored forces. The purchase of a good number of Centurions from the British happened as part of an agreement between the two countries. England needed help to finance the project for its new main battle tank, the Chieftain. Israel, in the same way, wanted to start building a new armored vehicle that would meet its needs, and the chance to join the Chieftain project was promising. So with the promise to purchase the old Centurions, the Israelis got the green light to participate in the development. Another important purchase for Israel's steel forces was the M48 Patton of American origin. In 1964, Israeli officers were secretly sent to West Germany to train in the operation of these vehicles, which were soon to be sent to Israel, because Tel Aviv had bought 150 of these tanks from the Germans. Due to pressure from Arab countries, Germany delivered only 40 armored vehicles, with the United States later providing the missing numbers. With an additional 100 tanks totaling 250 M48s made available to Israel by 1967. However, for the purposes of standardization and adaptation to the country's needs, the Israeli M48S would be modified, installing the 105mm 7 cannon in place of the original American 90mm cannons. This upgrade was the same one used by the Centurion. The turret of the M48 was also modified with the installation of the Urdan cupola, and new engines and transmissions were also installed, offering greater agility and battlefield vision for their crews. All armored vehicles of the Patton family in service with the Israeli army were called Megach. Israel still had in its ranks a range of Sherman variations, such as the M50 Super Sherman, the M51 Isherman, with American 105mm cannons, and other chassis modifications, including adaptations for rocket launching, artillery use, medical evacuations, and combat engineering operations. The lack of new French vehicles in the Israeli forces happened because of the diplomatic rift between the two countries after the fighting over the Suez Canal. In the following years, France increasingly adopted a neutral stance regarding the conflicts in the region. The fatal blow to the relationship between the two countries, however, would come in 1967, when 3 days before the start of the hostilities that were to come, France imposed a military embargo on the region, greatly affecting Israel's future operational capability. That year, through intelligence activities, Israel discovered that its Arab neighbors were planning a joint attack against its territory. The country had already been suffering attacks from Syria for over a year through artillery fire from Syrian positions located in the Golan Heights, the highest point in the region, which therefore provided greater effective range for long-distance attacks. After an intense internal debate about what they should do, it was with the appointment of a prominent figure to head Israel's Ministry of Defense that an unexpected action was taken. General Moshe Dayan, a former military officer and politician, now led the Israeli forces and chose a preemptive strike. At a time when Syrian, Egyptian, Jordanian, Iraqi, and Saudi forces were gathering for the offensive. The plan began on June 5, 1967, with a major air offensive against Egyptian bases, using supersonic fighter jets that bombed the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground, with more than 300 planes destroyed in less than 2 hours. This blow to the largest enemy air force eased the pressure in the battles that would come against Israel, as they would then have the tactical advantage of airspace control. In the following hours and days, other Arab countries' air forces were also struck and suffered heavy losses. Meanwhile, on the ground, the fight would be more difficult. In addition to the Soviet T-55S, Israel would have to face the Centurion tanks of the disciplined Jordanian troops, trained by European officers, as well as a large number of Panzer IVs from the Syrian army. These outdated armored vehicles, remnants of the Third Reich from World War II, were mostly used as improvised bunkers, partially buried in the ground. And, in some rarer cases, they were still used in the usual way. In total, the Arabs had more than 2,000 armored vehicles of all types, most of them located in the Sinai. At 8 in the morning, Israel's armored columns set off. 3 spearheads would advance into enemy territory, with the northern spearhead attacking the defensive lines at Khan Yunis and Rafah, reaching El Arish, a few kilometers to the west. No matter what conditions arose, whether or not there was communication, the Israelis had orders to shoot and advance without any pause. As they entered Khan Yunis, the first group of tanks to advance, made up of Magak armored vehicles, was met with a huge volume of small arms fire and rockets that ricocheted off the armor as it slowly made its way through the center of the village. The first tank, commanded by then-Lieutenant Avigdor Kihalani, began firing at local houses with its main cannon, when he realized they were being used as shelter by enemy troops. After 2 hours, the Israelis had already managed to capture the city. The next target was Rafah, and the Israeli armored vehicles headed there without hesitation. At a certain moment, the young Lieutenant Avigdor remembered seeing something strange on the horizon, like a dark line, which soon became obvious what it was. An Egyptian defensive line with armored vehicles in protected positions, their chassis concealed by the terrain. Even so, the stubborn Israelis kept moving forward at times, stopping only to fire a more accurate shot, exchanging fire with the Egyptian defenders, who fought with grit and determination until there was no way out. By nightfall, Rafah had also been captured by Israel, with the advance continuing through Egyptian fortifications until the capture of El Arish. To try to flank the Israelis, the Egyptians moved troops that were south of El Arish in an attempt at a surprise attack against the weary Israelis. But Israel's second spearhead intercepted them on the way, having gone directly through the desert in terrain with high dunes, few landmarks, and unstable ground. And so this second tank force clashed with the Egyptian 4th Armored Division, with their modern T-55 tanks thirsty for revenge. 200 Soviet armored vehicles against 100 British Centurions, a fight that would make many of the tank battles of World War II seem like small skirmishes by comparison. The tactical situation favored Israel in this battle. The Centurions' guns could fire accurately at longer ranges, and the Israeli crews had trained extensively for exactly this kind of engagement. The element of surprise also contributed to the final outcome, with about 80 Egyptian armored vehicles destroyed and the rest retreating. The spearhead, further south, would be one of the main axes of advance, with one of the most difficult tasks, the attack on Abu Aguila. The location was a well-known concentration of Egyptian troops, situated on terrain favorable to the defenders, and any attacker who wanted to launch a direct assault would have to climb the steep dunes and sand-covered hills. The command of the operation was in the hands of another well-known figure in Israel's military history, General Ariel Sharon. For his attack, he relied on paratrooper troops, artillery, 14,000 men, and 150 armored vehicles, including AMX-13S Centurions and all types of Shermans. The Egyptians, on the other hand, had positions in trenches, about 70 artillery pieces with a considerably greater range than those of the Israelis. 8,000 soldiers, knowledge of the terrain, and 66 T-34 tanks spread throughout the defensive sector to increase coverage and support in case the enemy attacked. Sharon's plan initially relied on a frontal attack, but this was quickly repelled by Egyptian forces in hidden positions, as well as a minefield and the difficult terrain. After this first contact, the idea was to corner the Egyptian troops in Abu Aguila by sending mechanized infantry to attack different sectors of the enemy at the same time. A highlight was a force composed of Centurion tanks, circling around the enemy position and attacking from the rear after passing through several observation posts along the way. Acting during the night, taking advantage of the sounds of enemy artillery fire to approach their targets without being detected. The battle resulted in 19 Israeli armored vehicles destroyed and 32 killed. Meanwhile, the Egyptians lost 40 armored vehicles and an unknown number of soldiers, with estimates showing up to 2,000 killed in the fighting. The advance of Israel's armored forces in the Sinai followed this pattern of attack until the end of the Six-Day War, when on June 10th, they captured the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. The monumental defeat of the Arab countries was evident not only in the amount of territory lost, but also in the speed with which they were defeated and the casualties they suffered. Israel, with a more modest force in quantitative terms, had prevailed. But even though the Six-Day War was a clear victory for the Israelis, post-combat studies still indicated many flaws to be corrected and more challenges to be faced with the new embargoes. England canceled the cooperation project with Israel for the development of the Chieftain a year after the end of the war, due to pressure from the Arab countries. The dependence on foreign technology and military equipment was a problem for the country, which, in cases of conflict, was often isolated from external support. Whether due to diplomatic and commercial sanctions or enemy military pressure, the United States also maintained a trade embargo on military equipment in the region until the end of 1967. The British had taken a year to cancel the joint project with Israel in order to obtain the necessary modification information for the armored vehicle to make it more effective in modern warfare. The Israelis, noticing this, refused to share the knowledge they had just acquired in the Six-Day War, because they already feared that, after refining the design of the British armored vehicle, they would be removed at the first opportunity. It is said that the British Ministry of Defense spoke with American representatives so that they would not sell armored vehicles to Israel, thus forcing them to cooperate on the project, a plan that failed completely. Israel was now in a dangerous position. With an outdated tank force, it was once again watching its Arab neighbors buying cutting-edge Soviet weaponry, like the iconic T-62, which was entering service in the Egyptian and Syrian armies. Israeli engineers, almost a generation behind in armored technology, would now have to come up with an alternative to the problem, developed entirely at home, or look for other opportunities. The alternatives presented to the Israeli army in August 1970 were as follows: buy large quantities of M48 Patton tanks, upgrade their engines and armaments to a higher standard, upgrade other M48s with new engines, a new turret, an experimental 110mm gun, and an advanced system for combat in environments contaminated by nuclear, biological, and chemical agents. Buy large quantities of American M60 armored vehicles, surrender to the British, and end up buying the Chieftain. Or finally, produce a new design of their own, with initial purchases of the project revolving around 300 tanks. And it was precisely this last option that was chosen, and only one man could lead the project. Major General Israel Talik Tal, a longtime military man, he joined the British forces back in 1942. And he served with the Jewish Brigade in Italy during the World War II, facing the German army. He spent most of his career in the infantry, but he had participated in several foreign equipment acquisition programs in previous decades, where his talent as an excellent evaluator of technologies and machines was noticed, earning him increasing power in the sector. Later appointed as deputy commander of Israel's armored forces, Tal insisted on the purchase of Centurions when they were still new. And he also assisted in the modernization program of the M48S that Israel had acquired. But Tal's most important characteristic was his understanding of Israel's strategic situation. Since he had been a soldier in the region, even before the country itself was founded, he observed the constant isolation that Israel suffered during times of war. The lack of material support from its so-called allies almost led the nation to complete destruction at certain times. And in this way, the Israeli tank project was started, with $100 million invested by the Ministry of Defense, with three main objectives: to provide the Israeli Defense Forces with a cutting-edge armored vehicle, to ensure that a foreign embargo on military products would no longer interfere with the operational capability of the force, and that the new tank would be built specifically for the requirements of the defense forces, with export capability not being taken into consideration for the new vehicle. Israel's most capable engineers were called to participate in the project, named Tochnit HaMerkava, or Chariot Program. However, in a country with a military-industrial complex that was limited to producing small arms and low-caliber ammunition, the technological leap required to produce a state-of-the-art armored vehicle would take years. And before that, Israel would face another challenge that would clearly show the reason why the Merkava project was so important. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War took place. Successive Israeli intelligence failures and lack of coordination between command posts, as well as poor decision-making in the country, led Israel to not prepare for yet another massive offensive by the Arab countries, launched precisely on Yom Kippur, one of the most important holidays in the Jewish calendar. Several points in Israeli territory were simultaneously attacked by Syrian and Egyptian troops, with other Arab countries and even North Korean volunteers fighting against Israel. The main focus of the armored offensive took place in two locations: in the Golan Heights, where only 180 Israeli armored vehicles had to face 1,400 Syrian tanks, and in the Sinai Peninsula, where nearly 850 Egyptian armored vehicles participated initially. The Arab forces operated T-55S and the modern T-62s, which faced the outdated but resilient Israeli force of Centurions, Patton family tanks such as the M48 and M60 and Shermans, with their numerous variations. As is well known, Israel managed to overcome the Arab invasion, but what is rarely discussed are its casualties, and especially where they came from. During the conflict, Israel faced over 6,000 enemy armored vehicles, resulting in 2,688 Israeli casualties. About 1,500 came from its armored battalions. But what could have caused such a massacre? The armored vehicles operated by Israel were already technologically outdated, with the Centurion and Patton tanks showing major weaknesses against the new Soviet tanks. The Arab countries also learned from the previous conflict and armed many of their troops with anti-tank weapons. From guided missiles with special warheads to destroy tank armor, to the famous RPGs, or rocket-propelled grenade launchers, which used hollow charges that were extremely effective against the outdated armored vehicles. Another factor was also the unique characteristics of the Israeli armored forces, which would prove to be a double-edged sword. The training schools for Israeli armored crews were considered the best in the world, with precision and long-distance combat being a hallmark of the country in the use of tanks. The new tactics used by the Arabs in the Yom Kippur War, however, forced a much closer combat than the Israelis were used to, causing many losses, besides the fact that now the T-62s could also fire at longer distances. Decisive factors for the turnaround in the conflict in the armored sector were the exceptional training of Israel's crews, their determination in fighting for their territory, and the cleverness of their commanders, who brilliantly exploited the enemy's mistakes. But even though numerically Israel's losses were lower than those of their opponents in the war, a huge wound appeared in their defensive capability. Israel has an extremely limited number of fighters at its disposal, even with a large number of reservists available. Taking them out of their roles in society and making them fully available to the armed forces creates a high cost for the Israeli state and for the country's productive chain, as well as it cannot be done instantly. Therefore, each soldier, crew member, and vehicle is extremely valuable for the very survival of the nation. The loss of valuable human resources in combat takes a long time to be replaced, trained, and put to the test. And this idea of preserving life to the fullest would become a trademark of its new armored vehicle. Even with peace sealed in the early 70s, Israel was still in danger. The lost Arab tanks were quickly replaced by the Soviet Union, but Israel, even with American material support, found its armored force in shambles. The solution was to maximize protection for the crews of the old tanks with improvised measures, such as increasing the number of machine guns on the tanks to fight infantry, and adding reactive armor to tanks like the Centurion and the Patton, which would explode on contact with rocket-propelled grenade rounds to redirect the impact. It's worth noting, however, that these modifications increase the weight and reduce the mobility and range of the armored vehicles. But to protect the crews in the short term, it was a risk that inevitably had to be taken. These changes in perspective were incorporated into the Merkava project, which was scheduled for delivery in 1979. Israel Tal was persistent in emphasizing that the focus of the project should be on crew protection. In this way, firepower came second, and the mobility of the armored vehicle came third. By making use of a thorough study of casualties in the Yom Kippur War, from ballistic reports of destroyed chassis to accounts from soldiers who were on the front lines, the engineers were able to refine the features of the project. The idea arose to make all parts of the tank act as armor for the crew in a concept of spaced armor. Its parts, fuel, and reservoirs would be positioned in such a way as to always offer some degree of protection to the most vulnerable part of the tank, its crew. The Israelis also inspected several modern tanks of their time, such as the AMX-30 Leopard 1, Chieftain, and the American XM-1. And a rumor even says that Tal briefly gained access to a very modern Soviet T-72 tank while he was in Eastern Europe. The foreign designs impressed Tal, but he knew that Israel's situation was very different from what the other powers had been preparing for. While the Warsaw Pact and NATO were planning to destroy each other on the calm plains of Germany, the Merkava would have a different purpose. The terrain in Israel was difficult and uneven, and its tank needed to remain stable under those conditions. The desert prevails around the country, so the new armored vehicle needed to perform flawlessly on sandy terrain. Thus, the Israeli industry began producing parts for the new main battle tank, whose dimensions would be enormous even by today's standards. Speed would be a lesser concern since Israeli territory is relatively small. The crew compartment and the turret would be different from other MBTs, being located at the rear of the chassis. At the front, the engine would be installed precisely to provide even more protection for the crew. Another important factor of the Merkava project was its ease of maintenance. It was found that during the Yom Kippur War, many armored vehicles suffered minor damage and had to wait up to 24 hours on the battlefield before having a component like their engine replaced. The Merkava could now have its engine completely replaced in combat conditions in less than an hour. In terms of armor, the tank was also impressive. Its chassis had heavily angled frontal armor, increasing the chances of enemy projectiles ricocheting. The rear part of the tank has a large hatch for exiting the armored vehicle, which could be used by the crew in emergencies. The hatch also highlighted another quality of the Merkava. The vehicle could carry a small contingent of infantry troops in a protected manner, or even offer protection to wounded soldiers in combat until medical evacuation was available. The removal of flammable items from the crew compartment and the storage of ammunition below the turret ring also contributed to the tank's survivability. The initial weapon chosen was the M68 cannon, 105 millimeters, with its lethality proven over years of use against Soviet tanks, which were almost diametrically opposed to what the Merkava turned out to be. While Soviet tanks had a reduced and much lower silhouette, focusing on greater agility for their large-scale incursions, the Merkava was an armored giant with a frontal silhouette reminiscent of Sweden's S-series tanks, which, in their firing position, appeared to be a smaller target than they actually were. Over the years, the details of the Merkava's development were kept hidden, with its designers hoping that no conflict would break out before they had finished their new vehicle. But on March 11, 1978, a radical Palestinian group set out from southern Lebanon towards the coast of Israel, hijacking 2 buses full of tourists, resulting in 38 hostages killed and another 70 injured, in one of the worst attacks on Israeli soil at the time. Soon, the Israeli response would bring the terrorists an enemy they had never known before. On the 31st anniversary of the founding of Israel, in May 1979, the new Merkava tank was shown to a crowd in a stadium during the Independence Day celebrations. It's 65 tons, 2 meters and 66 centimeters in height, 3 meters 72 centimeters in width, and 9 meters in length. Commanded respect from everyone around it. Military observers from around the world looked in astonishment at Israel's new creation, different in every aspect from anything they were used to. The armored giant was intimidating because of its size and design, but what impressed them even more was the fact that a group of 10 fully equipped soldiers emerged from its rear hatch after a while, showing that the steel monster had the capacity to transport troops. Today, it is already known that it is not common for the Merkava to carry that many troops inside, because it would have to sacrifice space for ammunition and other items inside. Even so, the psychological impact on the foreigners was noticeable. The Merkava's interior space was large, as it needed to carry more ammunition. Since the analysis of previous battles showed that it was common for a tank to run out of ammunition during combat, and the process of getting more supplies was very complex and time-consuming. This extra internal ammunition space in the protected front part of the tank could be swapped in short-range and infiltration missions to accommodate infantry, thus increasing the vehicle's support capability. The ammunition was usually arranged in the following way: 6 shells below the turret ready to be loaded into the cannon, 12 in 2 circular containers in the lower part of the chassis below the turret, and 44 shells stored in groups of 4 at the rear of the tank, totaling a maximum of 62 shells carried. The engine of the initial version of the Merkava was the Continental air-cooled V-engine diesel supercharged 1790 06A V12 with 900 horsepower, which, although it didn't provide the armored vehicle with high speeds, was strong enough to make it capable of overcoming obstacles like trenches and steep dunes. To make the armored vehicle require less maintenance in the field, Erdan Industries developed special bearings and wheels for the Merkava, with twice the lifespan of a conventional part used in armored vehicles. The Merkava's crew consisted of 4 men. The driver sat to the left of the engine, at the front of the armored vehicle, with the commander staying on the right side of the turret, behind the gunner, and the loader staying on the left side of the turret. The crew members had a good view of the outside, with periscopes and different optical magnification systems, many of which had access to night vision. Now that the Merkava had been revealed, it was initially positioned on the border with Syria to face possible aggression from its old enemies. But the armored vehicle's operational baptism would take place elsewhere in Lebanon, when on June 6, 1982, Israel announced Operation Peace for Galilee. The Israeli objective in invading Lebanon was to defeat the forces of the Palestine Liberation Army that were hiding there and planning and coordinating attacks on Israeli soil, hidden in foreign territory. The invasion triggered a conflict with Syria, as the country maintained a military contingent in Lebanon. In addition, many of its anti-aircraft radars and sensors covered the country's airspace. The performance of the Merkava in the conflict was exceptional, far exceeding the predictions of Israeli strategists. The new tank was the spearhead of Israel's armored columns, with the older M60 and modernized Centurions coming right behind. The Merkava showed great resilience against portable anti-tank weapons, such as the rocket-propelled grenade, 7 and Milan guided missiles, and was also able to easily repel the dangerous T-72 Sirius. In the Battle of the Bekaa Valley, Merkavas engaged T-72 Sirius tanks, destroying 8 Sirius armored vehicles, with no documented losses on the Israeli side. The advantages of the electronic fire and control systems, combined with the crew's sense of protection, significantly increased the effectiveness of the Israeli Merkavas. Compared to their adversaries, who could focus on detecting and destroying their targets with less concern about incoming enemy projectiles. During the year 1982, Israel lost only 7 Merkavas in Lebanon, 6 to landmines and rocket-propelled grenade, 7 hits. Many others were damaged but quickly repaired, with the survival rate in the armored vehicle being higher compared to the crews that suffered attacks in Centurions and M60. Even while the fighting was still going on in Lebanon, Israeli engineers, once again led by Talik Tal, were already working on improvements for the Merkava. By interviewing the crews returning from battle, they realized that the feedback about the armored vehicle was generally positive, but one negative point that had no solution was the difficulty of operating it in the narrow mountain passes of the region, since it was not possible to narrow the chassis for new variants. Another point observed in the Merkavas that had been destroyed is that most of them had been hit at the rear of the turret between that part and the chassis. This specific weak point was remedied by installing chains with steel balls which hang in that spot, and when they come into contact with anti-tank munitions, they detonate them prematurely, preventing any damage from being done to the interior. Even though it may seem like a worthless modification, installing these chains has greatly reduced the mortality of tanks from shots in that area. The 105mm cannons were very powerful and still posed a danger if fired from a close enough distance. So reinforcements to the turret and chassis armor were also made. The electronic systems were also redesigned and reinforced to withstand the impact of enemy munitions on the chassis. A neodymium laser rangefinder and new firing systems were also added, and the replacement of the transmission, which allowed for double the combat range, now reaching up to 500 kilometers. The commander also received a small 60mm mortar, which was carried inside the turret. All these changes were combined and resulted in the Merkava Mark II. The Merkava II also received support points on the structure for the installation of engineering equipment to clear roads and blockades. During the fighting in Lebanon, the engineering vehicles took too long to arrive at the locations, leaving the forces stationed in blocked areas vulnerable to attacks. Now, the equipment for removing minefields and debris was quickly installed on the Merkava tanks, which then continued on their way. The installation of 7.62 and .50 caliber machine guns on the tank was also done to help with defense against enemy infantry and helicopters, with them being operated from inside the armored vehicle. A few units also received a 40mm Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher for operations against infantry. The Mark II variant started in 1983 and continued until 1989. With the armored vehicle taking part in limited confrontations in Lebanon and carrying out more infantry support missions against insurgent groups like Hezbollah. The project for a new successor to the Merkava II had already begun weeks after the first units of the new model left the factory. Observing the situation of regional armored forces in 1983, it was possible to notice a pattern of constant modernization using French, Italian, Soviet, and American tanks. Their new approaches to armor and firepower required an equal upgrade to the Merkava to maintain its superiority in warfare. The first upgrade point would be firepower, with the replacement of the old L7 and M68 cannons, which had been used for so long. They considered producing an American cannon under license, but Tal insisted that everything be designed and produced 100% locally. The final decision was to equip the new Merkava III with a domestically produced 120mm cannon, the machine gun 251, but this meant sacrificing the amount of ammunition carried. The new shells would be larger, reducing the available internal space in the tank. These shells would be carried in compartments with capsules filled with fire-retardant material, which would prevent a fatal detonation in case of penetration, something that proved to be common in cases of chassis penetration that occurred in 1982 in Lebanon. Israel's growing high-tech electronics industry was just beginning to flourish at that time, with companies like Elbit, El Op, Rafael, and Elsint being invited to participate with additions to the Mark III project. These companies would assist in developing the Bakar Esh, the Merkava III's modern fire control system. The ability to fire with extreme accuracy while moving was a game changer for Merkava crews, who no longer needed to stop the tank to fire. A guided projectile detection system using electromagnetic sensors provided complete warning coverage in case of enemy fire. But there isn't much information about how it works, since it's highly classified. Another significant change in the Merkava III would be its new armor, which now had modular components that were easy to replace. The new version of the armored vehicle would have a fixed internal skeleton with an external shell whose parts would be removable, so that, in the future, technological improvements would allow the evolution of the battle tank without the need for extensive overhauls. In addition, combat damage could be quickly repaired, reducing the previous 48 hours needed for repairs to just 6 hours with the new configuration. Like much of the data about the Merkava, the composition and actual effectiveness of the armor are not known, as they are also kept secret. The Merkava Mark III also received nuclear, biological, and chemical protection against radioactive, chemical, and biological substances, given the use of such weapons by countries like Iraq in the 80s and 90s. The engine was also changed to a Continental air-cooled V-engine diesel supercharged, 1799 AR set with 1,200 horsepower, which allows the armored vehicle to take part in more agile combat more effectively than versions 1 and 2. The first, Merkava 3, was delivered in 1989 to the Israeli army on the 41st anniversary of the country's independence. In total, 750 Merkava 3s were produced up until 2003, when Merkava 4 construction started. The Merkava Mark IV would be the modernization of the Mark III, with new digital battlefield management and communication systems, new, more durable tracks, and an improved electronic firing system, which could now fire a range of more modern munitions. The Merkava 4 would feature several modifications, but its latest version, called the Mark 4M, received an innovative system to assist in the war against insurgents. Developed by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, the Trophy Active Protection System provides a kind of invisible shield against low-velocity projectiles fired at the tank. This is done by sensors installed on the armored vehicle, which emit electromagnetic waves and detect incoming enemy projectiles in a fraction of a second. The data, such as speed and trajectory, are then sent to a computer and to small explosive charge launchers, which fire another projectile at the incoming one, resulting in a premature detonation in the air and leaving the tank unharmed. A variation of the Mark IV chassis is the Namer Troop Transport Vehicle. With the removal of the Merkava's turret and the reorganization of some of its internal components, an entirely new infantry fighting vehicle was created, benefiting from the protection of the original armored vehicle. Now, in urban conflicts and high-density areas, Israel could transport infantry units to support the armored forces, an essential and vital task for the use of any type of vehicle in urban combat. The Merkava Mark IV-M began production in 2009 and was replaced in 2023 by its most modern version, the Mark IV Barak, which means lightning. The trophy system on the Barak was greatly upgraded with the addition of a new external camera system for the crew, which provides 360-degree coverage. With high-definition night vision available, which is integrated into a head-up display system that projects onto a special display for the commander, the images of the tank's surroundings are assisted by artificial intelligence. This system is called Iron Vision and is also present in the F-35 fighter jets. New data link systems also allow for the secure and efficient exchange of information between allied forces. It is possible to observe the use of the new versions of the Merkava in videos published over the past year during the fighting against Hamas on Israeli and Palestinian soil. However, it is important to know that the main function of the armored vehicle is to attack fortifications or engage other armored vehicles. Its use in urban warfare is limited to serving as an advancing unit or close support with the infantry, which is the key to its survival. This principle has been proven daily in the war in Ukraine. Russian advances in Ukrainian urban territory were often repelled when only armored vehicles entered without infantry support, since the use of portable anti-tank weapons has become much more common and effective nowadays. This coordination between steel and boots on the ground is difficult to train and requires discipline to develop. Images that circulated on the day of the Hamas attack in 2023 show guerrillas approaching a Merkava and firing at the armored vehicle. This resulted in a strong impact with the vehicle, which was later captured and destroyed. But if you look closely, you can see that the tank's cannon is still covered, so the vehicle was not in combat mode. Therefore, the trophy system, which needs power to operate, was probably turned off, showing that the crew was caught off guard. While the conflict is still unfolding, it's not possible to say for sure the real effectiveness of the Merkava, whose performance will still be, for a long time, the target of information warfare, delaying a more accurate analysis. The Merkava, however, remains a symbol of Israeli resistance in the face of adversity. Building a cutting-edge military equipment from scratch with an industrial complex that was still in its infancy amid an unfavorable geopolitical situation for decades. It's an incredible achievement in itself. In one of the few cases where the complete nationalization of a system's components was entirely favorable, the Israelis used all the knowledge they had gained since their founding to create today one of the most effective and technologically advanced battle tanks in the world, in a country that always needs to stay up to date to survive. For Israel, its military power is not just a matter of pride and persuasion, but a matter of life or death. In April 2025, the War Room will take you on an unforgettable journey to commemorate 80 years since the atomic age began. Follow in the footsteps of Robert Oppenheimer in the New Mexico desert, visit the Trinity Test Ground Zero, and get ready to fly in a B-29 bomber. All this and much more on the Atom Mission 2025 from the War Room. Access the link in the description because spots are limited. Watch now an exclusive interview with the night fighter ace of the Luftwaffe, Major Martin Dreves, winner of the Oak Leaves for the Knight's Cross, after achieving 52 kills in World War II. Learn about his career and personal life through his own words in this video, available only to premium members of the War Room. Become a channel member to access SDG Premium and have fun. So did you like our content? If you want Sala de Guerra to keep making these videos, consider supporting us. You can help us by sending us a Pix or through our campaign on Apoyacy. There, you'll get access to our exclusive WhatsApp group and have your name shown here in the videos. The link is right here in the description. Well, if you like this video, don't forget to share it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to Sala de Guerra to stay updated. I'll wrap it up here and thank you again for watching. And a big hug from the War Room.